The successful detonation of the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, was more than a scientific triumph. It was the moment a sword of Damocles was hung over the entire world. But in our timeline, the sword was forged for a specific purpose: to force a swift end to the grueling war against the Empire of Japan. Now, let's twist the fabric of history. Imagine a different spring of 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, not Harry Truman, witnesses the final reports from Europe. The war against Nazi Germany is not winding down. It is culminating in a nightmarish, street-by-street battle for Berlin, with fanatical SS units and Hitler Youth vowing to fight to the last man. In this alternate reality, the Manhattan Project's ultimate target is not the Japanese home islands, but the heart of the Third Reich itself. The question is no longer if to use the bomb, but where in Germany it would be most decisive. This shift in target would redefine the entire moral, strategic, and political calculus of the nuclear age before it even truly began. The primary driver for this hypothetical shift would be the projected cost of a final assault on Berlin. By April 1945, Allied intelligence painted a horrifying picture of the German capital. It was a fortress city defended by nearly 1 million soldiers, a mix of battered but experienced Wehrmacht units, fanatical Waffen-SS divisions, and the Volkssturm, a poorly trained but numerous militia of old men and boys. Soviet Marshal Zhukov was preparing for a battle he predicted would cost his Red Army 500,000 casualties. For the Western Allies, the thought of having to fight their way into the city from the west, potentially clashing with the Soviets in a chaotic urban melee, was a strategic nightmare. The atomic bomb, in the eyes of military planners, would appear as a tool to avoid this bloodbath. It could decapitate the Nazi command, shatter the last organized centers of resistance, and demonstrate such overwhelming power that any remaining German will to fight would evaporate instantly. The bomb would be used not just to end the war, but to prevent a final, catastrophic battle that could claim another 1 million lives. The selection of a target would become a matter of intense debate within the target committee. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen in our timeline for their military-industrial significance and to showcase the bomb's destructive power on a relatively untouched urban center. For Germany, the criteria would be similar, but with a profound political dimension. Berlin would be the obvious, symbolic choice. Obliterating the Reich Chancellery, the Führer bunker, and the central command structure would have an undeniable psychological impact. However, other targets would be seriously considered. A city like Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi Party, could be targeted for its symbolic value as the Hauptstadt der Bewegung, capital of the movement. A major industrial and military hub like Leipzig or a key naval base like Kiel might be chosen to cripple Germany's last remaining war-making capacity. The decision would weigh the military objective against the message it sent to the world and to the advancing Soviet Union. The logistical challenge of delivering the bomb would be immense, but surmountable. The B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft designed to carry the atomic bomb, was based in the Pacific. They would need to be transferred to airfields in Britain or, more likely, in recently captured territory in France or Belgium. This would require a massive and secretive airlift of the specialized bombers, their support equipment, and the precious, assembled nuclear components. The mission would be flown by the 509th Composite Group, as in our timeline, but their training would have focused on European weather patterns, German flak defenses, and the longer overland routes. The mission profile would be one of extreme danger. German air defenses, though degraded, were still far more robust and technologically advanced than Japan's. The Luftwaffe's jet fighters, like the Me-262, could pose a serious threat to the high-flying but slow and vulnerable B-29s. The success of a mission would hinge on achieving complete surprise and a strong fighter escort for part of the journey. The timing of the drop would be the most critical factor of all. Let's place it in late April 1945. The Red Army has encircled Berlin and is fighting its way into the city's outskirts. American and British forces have halted at the Elbe River, respecting the pre-agreed occupation zones with Stalin. The world is waiting for the final bloody act to play out. Then, without warning, a single American aircraft appears over the capital of the Third Reich. The bomb bay doors open. The choice to use the bomb at this precise moment would be a deliberate act to end the European war on Western terms. It would be a demonstration to Joseph Stalin that the United States possessed a weapon of unimaginable power and was willing to use it to shape the post-war order. The nuclear age would not dawn in the Far East, but in the very center of Europe, its first flash illuminating the ruins of the Nazi Empire and casting a long, new shadow over the continent, a shadow that would fall directly on the Soviet forces just miles away. The Cold War would not begin with a partitioned Germany, but with an atomic Berlin. In this alternate timeline, the blinding flash that incinerated Berlin did not bring a swift conclusion to the Second World War. With the atomic sword fallen upon Europe, the war in the Pacific grinds on with horrific, inevitable momentum. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, is no longer a contingency to be avoided, but a grim, official reality. The bomb, having been spent on Nazi Germany, is not yet available for Japan. The nuclear assembly line is still in its infancy, and the second device would not be ready for weeks, if not months. In the interim, the largest amphibious invasion in human history is set into motion. The United States and its allies now face the prospect that haunted every Allied planner: a ground invasion of Japan that would make the carnage of the Western Front look like a skirmish. Operation Downfall was a two-part leviathan of a plan, and in this scenario, it is activated in full. The first phase, Operation Olympic, is scheduled for November 1st, 1945. Its objective is the southernmost island of Kyushu. The goal is not conquest, but the seizure of airfields and harbors to serve as a springboard for the decisive second act. The second phase, Operation Coronet, targeted the Kanto Plain near Tokyo from March 1946, a direct thrust at the Japanese capital itself. The scale is almost incomprehensible. For Olympic, the initial landing force would involve 14 divisions, dwarfing the D-Day landings in Normandy. The entire First Army would be redeployed from Europe, its veterans of the Battle of the Bulge and the drive into Germany now destined for the bloody beaches of Japan. They would be joined by Marines and divisions from the Pacific Theater, creating a force of over 750,000 men for the initial assault alone. Awaiting them is a Japan transformed into a fortress nation. The American intelligence intercepts, known as MAGIC, revealed the Japanese strategy, Ketsugo, Operation Decision. The defense of Kyushu was not to be a battle at the water's edge. It was to be a battle of annihilation in the interior. Having studied the American island-hopping campaign, Japanese command understood they could not prevent a landing. Instead, they planned to draw the invading forces into a series of prepared killing zones after they were ashore. The geography of Kyushu, rugged, mountainous terrain punctuated by limited valleys, was perfect for this defense. The Japanese had mobilized the entire nation for a fight to the death. The civilian population, including women and children, were being trained with bamboo spears, primitive explosives, and instructions to kill at least one American before dying themselves. The military preparations were even more formidable. Intelligence estimates, later proven to be significantly low, predicted 350,000 defenders on Kyushu. In reality, by the summer of 1945, the Japanese had concentrated nearly 900,000 soldiers on the island, with thousands of aircraft, including kamikaze units, held in reserve for a mass, decisive blow against the invasion fleet. The human cost projected for downfall was the stuff of nightmares. Based on the casualty rates from the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders had fought nearly to the last man, planners generated stark estimates. The invasion of Kyushu alone was expected to result in between 250,000 and 500,000 American casualties, with tens of thousands of those being fatalities. Japanese military and civilian deaths were projected to be in the millions. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was so appalled by the projections that he ordered a study on the potential use of chemical weapons to break the stalemate that was sure to develop. The United States government, in a grim and secretive preparation, manufactured 500,000 Purple Heart medals in anticipation of the flood of wounded. This stockpile would remain in use until the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The invasion would be an unprecedented slaughter. The landings on Kyushu would be met not with a direct counterattack, but with a storm of steel from the surrounding hills. Kamikaze aircraft, flying from hidden airstrips across the home islands, would descend upon the densely packed invasion fleet in waves far exceeding anything seen at Okinawa. The goal was to sink so many transports and supply ships that the landed forces would be isolated and starved of reinforcements and ammunition. On land, the fighting would descend into a brutal, slow-moving campaign of attrition. The American advantage in armor and mobility would be neutralized by the broken terrain and deeply dug-in Japanese positions. Every cave, every ridge, every village would become a strong point to be reduced with flamethrowers, grenades, and bloody close-quarters combat. The Japanese strategy was not to win, but to inflict such catastrophic losses that the American public would lose its stomach for the war and agree to a negotiated peace, one that would preserve the imperial system and avoid an unconditional surrender. As the November 1st date for Operation Olympic approaches in this timeline, a palpable dread settles over the American military and the home front. The troops, many of whom had fought their way across Europe, now face a prospect more terrifying than the Wehrmacht. The atomic bombing of Berlin, while ending the war in Europe, has paradoxically condemned the Pacific theater to a more primitive, more personal form of annihilation. The world holds its breath, not for a flash of light in the sky, but for the sound of the landing craft ramps dropping onto the beaches of Kyushu, the starting gun for the final and bloodiest chapter of the Second World War. Operation Downfall is no longer a historical footnote of what might have been. It is the unfolding reality, a testament to the fact that in this world, the nuclear age began in Europe, leaving the war in the Pacific to be concluded with the last full measure of conventional bloodshed. The date is April 30th, 1945. In our timeline, this marks the day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker as Soviet soldiers fought through the streets above. But in this alternate history, the war in Europe ends not with a whimper in a subterranean chamber, but with a cataclysm that shakes the very foundations of the continent. A single B-29 Super Fortress, having taken off from a hastily prepared airfield in France, flies at high altitude over a Berlin that is already a smoldering ruin from conventional bombing. The Red Army has encircled the city, and the sounds of their artillery are constant thunder. The mission, codenamed Operation Judgment, is a calculated act of geopolitical theater. The bomb bay doors open, and little boy, the uranium gun-type device, falls toward the heart of the Third Reich. The target is not a random residential district, but a precise, symbolic triangle: the Reich Chancellery, the Tiergarten, and the Führer bunker. The detonation, equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, does not just destroy buildings. It obliterates the central nervous system of Nazism and fundamentally rewrites the conclusion of World War II in Europe. The immediate physical effect is beyond comprehension. The fireball vaporizes everything within a half-mile radius. The Reich Chancellery, the Brandenburg Gate, and the entire government quarter are transformed into atomic glass. The Führer bunker, deep as it is, becomes a mass tomb, its occupants instantly killed by the shock wave and subsequent radiation. The blast wave radiates outward at supersonic speeds, flattening what remained of central Berlin. The charred, skeletal ruins left by months of bombing are now swept clean in an instant, replaced by a vast, radioactive wasteland. The human cost is incalculable. Not only are the remaining Nazi leadership and the last die-hard defenders annihilated, but so are thousands of civilians who had taken refuge in the city's cellars and shelters, along with the forward units of the Red Army who were poised to capture the Reichstag, now just a memory on the horizon. The psychological and political shockwaves travel even faster than the physical ones. For the remaining German forces still fighting across Europe, the news, spread by radio and desperate word of mouth, is apocalyptic. The Central Command is gone. The Führer is confirmed dead. The capital has ceased to exist. Any lingering hope for a mythical counteroffensive or a negotiated peace through political division evaporates in the nuclear fire. The will to fight shatters completely. Within 48 hours, organized German resistance collapses. Commanders who moments before were following orders to fight to the last man now send out envoys under white flags. The formal, unconditional surrender of all German forces is signed not in a French schoolhouse, but likely in a makeshift American headquarters, with the Soviet leadership forced to attend as secondary partners to an American-dictated peace. The United States, not the Soviet Union, is seen by the world and by a traumatized European populace as the nation that single-handedly ended the war against Nazism. The reaction from the Kremlin is one of fury mixed with profound strategic terror. Joseph Stalin, who believed the capture of Berlin was to be the ultimate prize validating Soviet sacrifices, is robbed of his triumph. The Red Army, which bled so terribly to reach the city, is now halted at its outskirts, not by German defenders, but by an invisible, deadly wall of radiation and an unambiguous display of American power. Stalin sees the bombing for what it is, not just an attack on Berlin, but a brutal, unilateral message to the Soviet Union. The Americans have not only ended the war, but have done so in a manner that deliberately contains Soviet political and territorial ambitions. There is no Soviet occupation of Berlin. There is no division of the city. There is only an American-controlled, radioactive zone. The Potsdam Conference, scheduled for July, would now be held under a completely different dynamic. The United States arrives not as one of the big three, but as the undisputed, nuclear-armed hegemon of Europe. The moral calculus of the war is permanently altered. In our timeline, the atomic bombings of Japan remain a subject of intense historical debate, justified by many as a necessary evil to avoid the greater bloodshed of Operation Downfall. In this timeline, that justification is absent in the Pacific but applied to Europe. The Allied propaganda machine would frame the Berlin bomb as a necessary measure to prevent the million casualties predicted in a final assault on the city and to swiftly end a war against an irredeemably evil regime. The narrative would be one of surgical, decisive strike against the Nazi leadership, tragically costly in civilian lives, but ultimately merciful when compared to the alternative of urban warfare on an unprecedented scale. However, the image of using a weapon of mass destruction on a European capital, one already besieged and on the verge of collapse, would create a deep and lasting moral scar on the American conscience and its global image. The good war would have a far more ambiguous, darker ending. The Berlin bomb creates a stark new world on May 1st, 1945. Europe is free from Nazism, but it is not at peace. It is frozen in a new kind of fear. The Soviet Union, humiliated and threatened, would accelerate its own nuclear program with frantic urgency, viewing the United States not as a wary ally, but as an existential threat that has already demonstrated its willingness to use the ultimate weapon. The Cold War does not begin with tentative steps and spheres of influence. It begins with a single, shocking act of nuclear dominance. The Iron Curtain would still fall, but its eastern edge would be drawn not at the Elbe, but further east, with a terrified and enraged Soviet Union digging in for a confrontation it now knows it is currently losing. The war in Europe is over, but the peace has been stillborn, replaced by a radioactive silence over Berlin and the deafening tick of a new, global clock counting down to the next potential atomic confrontation. The atomic incineration of Berlin did not just obliterate the Nazi high command. It vaporized the fragile political understanding that had held the Grand Alliance together. For the Soviet Union, the event was a seismic shock that fundamentally recalibrated its position in the world. In an instant, the Red Army, the most powerful land force on the globe, a battle-hardened juggernaut that had crushed 80% of the Wehrmacht, found its strategic value catastrophically diminished. The blood-soaked victory march from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin was rendered geopolitically irrelevant by a single airplane from a nation that had suffered a fraction of Soviet losses. The Soviet Union stood triumphant across Eastern Europe, but felt more vulnerable than at any time since the dark days of 1941. The question was no longer about dividing the spoils of war, but about surviving in a world where their former ally had just demonstrated the capacity and the will to unilaterally rewrite the conclusion of a world war. Joseph Stalin, the ultimate realist, received the news of the bombing with cold, calculating fury. His paranoia, often a liability, now served him well. He saw the attack not as a military necessity against Germany, but as the opening salvo of the next war, a war aimed directly at the Soviet Union. The timing was unmistakable. The bomb was dropped not when the Reich was strong, but when it was on its last legs, with the Red Army mere miles from the city center. The message was clear: thus far and no further. The American objective, in Stalin's view, was to prevent the Soviet occupation of central Germany and to intimidate the Kremlin into submission before the post-war order was even established. The Potsdam Conference, now a formality, would be a theater of shadows. Stalin would attend, but he would be playing a desperate, defensive game, his every move constrained by the terrifying knowledge that the United States held a monopoly on a weapon that could destroy his armies without a single tank battle. The immediate military consequence was a forced, humiliating strategic pause. The Red Army's spearheads, poised to sweep across the rest of Germany and perhaps into Denmark, were abruptly ordered to halt and consolidate. The prospect of facing an enemy that could erase entire army groups from existence made further offensive operations suicidal. The Soviet military doctrine of deep operation, based on mass and momentum, was instantly obsolete. What did it matter if you could field 5 million men if they could be annihilated in a handful of concentrated flashes? The Soviet occupation zone, which in our timeline stretched to the Elbe River and included half of Berlin, was now truncated. The line of demarcation was likely pushed significantly eastward, perhaps to the Oder River, with the Americans claiming all of a radioactive and leaderless Germany. The Soviet Union was denied not just territory, but the reparations, industrial plant, and scientific talent they had counted on to rebuild their shattered nation. This humiliation and perceived encirclement triggered two simultaneous, frantic responses from the Kremlin. The first was a massive conventional military buildup. If quality of force was now trumped by a single weapon of quality, then the Soviet Union would respond with overwhelming quantity. The demobilization that occurred after the war in our timeline was canceled. The Red Army remained at full strength, a multi-million man force deployed across Eastern Europe as a vast defensive buffer. They dug in, preparing for a conflict they now believed was inevitable. The second, and far more critical response, was the absolute, no-expense-spared prioritization of the Soviet atomic bomb project. Stalin summoned the head of the NKVD, Lavrentiy Beria, and the scientific director, Igor Kurchatov. The message was simple: get a bomb at any cost. The espionage efforts of the likes of Klaus Fuchs, already valuable, became the Kremlin's top strategic priority. Every resource of the state was diverted to this single goal. The Gulag system swelled with scientists and engineers working under the gun. The Soviet nuclear program, which in our timeline took until 1949 to bear fruit, would be accelerated with manic intensity, possibly shaving a full year or more off the development time. The political landscape of Eastern Europe was also forged in this new, darker fire. In our timeline, Stalin established puppet regimes through a combination of political subversion and the implicit threat of the Red Army's presence. In this world, the process is far more brutal and overt. The countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania are not merely brought into a sphere of influence. They are locked down as a defensive glacis, a necessary buffer zone against the American nuclear threat. Any dissent is crushed with even greater severity than in our history. The Iron Curtain does not descend. It is slammed down, its foundations poured from concrete and fear. There is no pretense of coalition governments or free elections. The message to the West is clear. This territory is essential for our survival, and we will hold it by any means necessary. Thus, the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Berlin bomb is a paradox. A conventional military superpower living in a state of profound strategic insecurity. It possesses the largest army in history, yet feels besieged and vulnerable. It has won the war, yet feels it has lost the peace before it even began. The Cold War begins not with the ambiguity of Yalta and Potsdam, but with a definitive, terrifying act. The world is not bipolar but lopsided. The United States holds the ultimate weapon and the moral authority of having vanquished the Nazi regime single-handedly. The Soviet Union holds the land, but lives under the shadow of the bomb. Its leadership consumed by a desperate race to achieve parity and a burning resentment that would define the next half-century of global conflict. The Red Army had answered the German question with overwhelming force, but now it faced the American question, for which it had no immediate answer beyond a desperate, fearful scramble for its own mushroom cloud. While Europe reels from the nuclear conclusion to its war, the Pacific theater descends into a hell of a different kind, a hell of relentless conventional slaughter. The atomic bomb, having been expended on Berlin, is not an option for President Truman in the summer of 1945. The complex process of assembling a second device would take critical weeks, and the third bomb is still a theoretical possibility, not a tangible weapon. The Japanese Empire, sensing no cataclysmic ultimatum and interpreting the silence from America as strategic hesitation, digs in for its final, fanatical defense. The result is the grim activation of Operation Downfall, the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. The war, which ended abruptly in our August 1945, now grinds on into a bloody autumn and a horrific winter, becoming a conflict of attrition that would be seared into the American and Japanese psyche as the costliest chapter of the entire Second World War. The first phase, Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, commences on schedule on November 1st, 1945. The sight that greets the American invasion force is unlike anything they have ever witnessed. The beaches are not heavily defended at the water's edge. They are eerily quiet. The Japanese have learned from Poliliu and Iwo Jima. Their strategy, Ketsugo, is to draw the invaders inland into a series of prepared, interlocking kill zones in the island's rugged, mountainous interior. The initial landings meet only sporadic resistance, luring the Americans into a false sense of progress. Then, as the troops push beyond the coastal plains, the storm breaks. From hidden caves, fortified ridges, and camouflaged pillboxes, a hurricane of fire erupts. The Japanese have pre-positioned artillery and mortars on reverse slopes, immune to naval gunfire, and they rain shells with pinpoint accuracy on the advancing American divisions. The fighting is immediate and brutal, reducing advances to a yard-by-yard crawl. The American advantage in mobility and armor is neutralized by the broken terrain and intricate defensive networks. Simultaneously, the skies and seas erupt in chaos. The Japanese unleash the full force of their reserve kamikaze corps in a coordinated, desperate effort to sever the invasion fleet from its landed forces. Thousands of aircraft, many of them obsolete trainers or makeshift bombs, swarm the American armada off the coast of Kyushu. They're joined by waves of Shinyo suicide boats and Kaiten human torpedoes. The naval losses are staggering, eclipsing any previous battle in the Pacific. Dozens of ships are sunk, including precious aircraft carriers and troop transports. The decks of American vessels run red, and the sea is littered with burning oil and debris. While American naval air power and anti-aircraft fire take a devastating toll, the kamikazes achieve their goal. They create a logistical nightmare, sinking critical supply ships and slowing the reinforcement of the beachhead. The American forces ashore find themselves in a desperate race against time, needing to secure a port and expand their perimeter before their ammunition and medical supplies run critically low. On the ground, the battle descends into a new level of savagery. The Japanese defenders, a mix of hardened veterans from China and conscripted civilians, fight with a terrifying fatalism. Surrender is rare, bonsai charges, though costly, are used to disrupt American lines and instill terror. The American soldier, many of whom are veterans of the European campaign, finds the nature of the combat fundamentally different. There are no clear front lines, no rear areas safe from infiltration. Every hill, every valley, every village is a fortress. The Japanese use the civilian population as a shield and a weapon, and the Americans, hardened by years of brutal island warfare, often have no choice but to treat every structure as a potential stronghold. Flamethrowers and satchel charges become the primary tools of advance. The casualty reports flowing back to Washington are apocalyptic, matching and then exceeding the worst-case projections. The 500,000 Purple Hearts manufacture and preparation are expended within the first 2 months. This protracted butchery fundamentally alters the American home front. The victory in Europe, so recently celebrated, is now overshadowed by the grim telegrams arriving daily from the Pacific. The public, which had supported the war effort with determined resolve, begins to show fractures. Bring the boys home protests, which were minor in our 1945, gained significant momentum. The moral justification for the war remains, but the cost begins to feel unbearable. The government is faced with a terrible dilemma: continue the horrific meat grinder on Kyushu or authorize the use of the next atomic bomb, which is now finally becoming available on a Japanese city. However, the context has changed. The bomb is no longer a surprise weapon to shock a nation into surrender. It is now a potential tool to break a military deadlock, to be used against an enemy that is already fully engaged in a fight to the death on its own soil. The decision is fraught with a new kind of moral weight. For Japan, the invasion confirms their worst fears and hardens their resolve. The American demon is on the sacred soil of the homeland, and the costly American advance seems to validate the military's argument that they can make the invasion so painful that the Americans will negotiate. However, the reality on the ground in Kyushu is a nightmare for the Japanese people. Millions of civilians are caught in the crossfire, subjected to relentless artillery barrages, aerial bombing, and close-quarters combat. The Japanese military's policy of using them as auxiliaries and human shields leads to catastrophic civilian casualties. Famine and disease begin to spread as the agricultural and social structure of southern Japan collapses. The war has become a national suicide, a slow-motion destruction of a nation and its people, all for an emperor who remains secluded in Tokyo, his government paralyzed between militarists who refuse to admit defeat and realists who see the utter annihilation of their country unfolding day by day. The Pacific, without the quick end of the atomic bomb, becomes a charnel house, a testament to the fact that the final defeat of an entrenched, fanatical enemy in the industrial age could only be achieved through a level of bloodletting that would stain the victor for generations. The final torture gasp of the Second World War did not come with a formal surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay, but with the bloody, grinding conclusion of Operation Coronet on the Kanto Plain in the spring of 1946. The invasion of Honshu, even more costly than the nightmare on Kyushu, finally shattered the Japanese Empire's ability to resist. The surrender, when it came, was not the result of a single, shocking weapon, but the exhausted collapse of a nation bled white by conventional warfare. The post-war world that emerged from this prolonged butchery was fundamentally different from our own. The Cold War did not begin with a divided Germany. It was born in a partitioned Japan, a nation torn asunder by the very forces that had liberated it from its militarist past, creating a geopolitical fault line that would define the next half-century. The occupation of Japan was not the unified, American-led project overseen by General Douglas MacArthur that we know from history. With the Red Army having steamrolled through Manchuria in August 1945, as in our timeline, and with no atomic bombs to compel a swift Japanese surrender before their entry, Soviet forces did not stop at the water's edge. As the bloody struggle for the home islands raged, Stalin saw his opportunity. Soviet troops, in a mirror image of the Allied landings, conducted amphibious assaults on the northern island of Hokkaido and established a foothold in northern Honshu. By the time the final surrender was signed, the Soviet Union controlled all of Korea north of the 38th parallel and a significant portion of northern Japan. The Japanese archipelago was brutally bifurcated. The United States occupied the southern and central islands, including a devastated Tokyo, while the Soviet Union established the Democratic People's Republic of Japan in the north, with its capital in the city of Sapporo. This division created an immediate and terrifying flashpoint. The ideological chasm of the Cold War was now physical, running through the Straits of Tsugaru and across the mountains of Honshu. A Japanese wall was erected, not of concrete initially, but of barbed wire, minefields, and opposing armies. The Soviet-controlled North became a closed, totalitarian state, modeled on North Korea, its industry nationalized, its society subjected to rigid Stalinist control, and its military integrated into the Soviet Far Eastern Command. It served as a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarine base for the Soviet Pacific Fleet, directly threatening American interests across the Pacific. The American-controlled South, meanwhile, became the Republic of Japan, a demilitarized democracy under the American nuclear umbrella, its new constitution explicitly forbidding the maintenance of a military, just as in our timeline, but now for the urgent reason that its entire territory was a front line. The global psychological impact was profound. The West, particularly the United States and Great Britain, was united not by the abstract threat of Soviet expansionism, but by the visceral, shared trauma of the Pacific War. The memory of the millions of casualties suffered in Operation Downfall forged an iron bond between the Anglo-American powers. There was no room for the post-war idealism that characterized the early UN in our world. Instead, there was a hardened, grim determination to contain the Soviet Union at all costs. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed not just as a defensive pact, but as a direct response to the Soviet foothold in Japan, an explicit acknowledgement that the Cold War was now a global, two-ocean confrontation. The special relationship between the US and UK was cemented in the blood spilled on the beaches of Kyushu. The nuclear arms race was simultaneously accelerated and distorted. The United States, having used its first bomb on Berlin, possessed a demonstrated willingness to employ nuclear weapons against a major power. The Soviet Union, occupying half of Japan and feeling directly threatened, redoubled its efforts, likely achieving its first atomic test in 1948 or early 1949. But the strategic doctrine was different. In our timeline, the primary nuclear threat was intercontinental. In this one, the most immediate danger was tactical. Both superpowers positioned massive conventional and tactical nuclear forces along the Japanese partition, creating a standoff reminiscent of the Fulda Gap in Germany, but with the added volatility of an island nation with a recent history of fanatical militarism. The world lived with the constant fear that a skirmish on the Japanese border could escalate into a tactical nuclear exchange. The legacy for Japan was a national tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The country was not only physically destroyed by the invasion, but spiritually and politically broken by its division. It became the Germany of the Pacific, a nation forever separated from parts of itself. Families were torn apart, a unified culture was severed, and the Japanese people became pawns in a global struggle they no longer controlled. The Southern Republic of Japan, though economically successful under American patronage, lived under the constant shadow of its northern twin, a permanent reminder of its defeat and dismemberment. Thus, the cradle of the Cold War was not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the occupied cities and partitioned islands of Japan. The decision to use the atomic bomb on Europe first created a chain of events that led to a longer, bloodier war in the Pacific and a far more dangerous and entrenched global confrontation. The world was not split between East and West Germany, but between North and South Japan, ensuring that the Pacific Rim would remain the most militarized and tense frontier of the Cold War. The bitter peace that followed World War II was, in this reality, built on the foundation of a divided Japan, a constant, festering wound that guaranteed the ideological conflict of the 20th century would be longer, colder, and infinitely more perilous.